Okay, so welcome everybody. This morning we have a webinar by our PUPP partner, Ceceilia Parnther, who's an associate professor of executive leadership at Moyne College. Her research focuses on academic integrity, equity, and student success, which we all want. She regularly writes and presents on issues of academic integrity and is currently editor-in-chief of the Academic Integrity and Referencing Skill Module for Student Success with Sage Learning Resources. Ceceilia, I'm leaving you the floor.
Thank you so much. And I'd just like to thank everyone for joining today. I am preparing to share my PowerPoint here, but as I do so, I also like to thank you for your flexibility this morning with our rescheduled meeting time. Here we are. Okay, so as I can see from the folks who have joined, some of us are already experts in the room on referencing, so we'll keep that in mind as we continue to have this conversation. But I think that it will also allow us to just have a really robust discussion about, our why and purpose for focusing and refocusing on the issue of referencing in a changing academic environment. So Martine so graciously introduced me. I'm recently new to Moyne in executive leadership. My background is higher ed leadership and policy. And so all of these little descriptors are really just used to say, I care about how our students learn, the ways that they learn, and making sure that we're acknowledging our responsibility in knowledge that's generated, both in terms of who that knowledge has belonged to, how we make it accessible, or as accessible as possible, but how we're also attributing ownership and honor to work that has come out. So in terms of housekeeping, I'm happy to just look at the chat as questions come up, because I'm hoping that this will also be able to be a discussion as we go throughout. So I'll be checking that at various times, but because there are so few of us, I think you can feel free to kind of just raise your little hand on the icon or simply unmute so that we can engage in discussion as well, whatever works for you. I'm also a former student conduct administrator, specifically in academic integrity at a few institutions, some who had honor codes, some who did not, working with student affairs and academic affairs units as well. And so I always keep these little cups of tea in my little bio, because that's more interesting, one, than my picture, but also because I think that we all come to this work with a background in stories and positionality that are really important when we think through learning concepts. And so for me, mine is tea. I think about that because I think about lessons that I've learned from my mother. My mom is not an academic, but she's one of the warmest people that you'll ever meet. And her ministry is really hospitality. So if someone passes away, or someone is new to the area, or someone is needing comfort and warmth, you would find my mother there, inviting them into our home, pouring a cup of tea, making sure that you're well fed. And that's how I was raised, and that's how I learned to be who I am. And so I find that I use this in my research and work. It guides me a lot for a couple of reasons. One, because it's important to listen and hear what someone else has to say, even though we don't have the answers. It's important to help others to feel comfortable, help others to feel warm, and hopefully leave them with something that's a little bit better than what they found when they started the conversation. And I open with that in most of the conversations that I have, because I think that it's important that we consider like those symbols and those stories that kind of guide our work, whether they're academic or not. And we'll revisit that a little later. So in getting to know you all, I'm hoping that we can reflect a little bit on just who you are in relationship to this type of work. I mean, we have some incredible scholars on the call. We have emerging researchers, students, folks who are really committed to this work. But I'd just like you to think to yourselves how you use referencing academically, and how you use it otherwise professionally. And maybe even at this point, when we're thinking about social media and things like that, how you attribute knowledge personally. I would add that to this. And I'm also hoping that you'll be willing to share with me, perhaps in the chat, what big ideas you think would be beneficial for us to make sure that we review during this webinar. I walk in with a certain set of assumptions, but I want you to walk out with something valuable. So if there is something that is not addressed or that you would like to cover specifically, feel free to put that in. And as much as I'm able, I definitely like to engage in that conversation. And then finally, if there are any big questions that you have. So today our goal is to review the significance of referencing, and then to get into that a little bit deeper and talk about the purpose of referencing and the standards that guide referencing practice. And then finally, getting into some of those new considerations for referencing that promote academic integrity, but also improve the clarity of academic writing. Because the point is, we want students who are confident, who can concisely understand information and share it for the benefit of as many audiences as possible. So, what's the significance of referencing? This is really easy for us, right? Because we understand referencing to be that gold standard of how we establish our position in the literature, in knowledge generation. So first, we're establishing credibility. We are showing to our academic community that based on our understanding of a text, of a concept, of a study, that we're able to situate it within an argument. We are saying that based on our awareness of those things, that we find that literature or that content to be of high quality, to be vetted, and that you can trust us because we've done that work. Also giving credit where credit is due, right? Because we haven't made up these big ideas. So many of the ideas that I'm sharing for you, almost, I guess all of the ideas that I'm sharing with you today, have come from scholars and content creators who have given us gifts, have shown us the way that they think through things, and that's very valuable. And it's really important that we acknowledge them as we dig deeper into the work. Of course, we want to avoid plagiarism because we don't want to suggest that we've created something that we haven't. We don't want to misrepresent that. And that's going to be a big piece of what today is also about. And it also enhances the quality of our research because we are aligning ourselves, right, to a set of standards and practices that our fields set as this gold standard. So whether it's making sure that we have those italics and making sure that we know what DOIs are and things like that, we are saying that we align with the standards of practice that are inherent to our discipline, and that we make sure that our new addition to the literature matches in that way, like that we're following those standards. So we had a comment in the chat that talks about the worst part is making sure that the references and citations are accurate, and that too is my experience. So thank you very much for that. Sometimes I find that for myself and my students, you can get so hung up in the formatting pieces that sometimes why becomes it becomes less centered. And for me, it helps when I'm teaching students to center that piece and then just trying to memorize the rules of the game as it relates to the formatting piece. So the next piece of this is I pulled up a map. This is a map of London. And the reason why I did is because references help us to map out where we're going. If you are a reader of an article and you're looking through and all of a sudden you get to this reference list, the reference list is going to walk me through the decisions that were made to get me where I am, to get me to the conclusion of your paper. And that's not always a linear thing, because we're taking big ideas, we're taking our interpretation, we're restating, we're putting it in context to another person's work to guide folks through this story that we're trying to tell. And if we do that well, then the reference list for them is also this guidebook where they can go and revisit some of that source material and they can understand their map. But when we put things on our reference list that don't belong on the map, then folks get lost. So what else causes us to lose our way? The mechanics of the thing. Formatting can be difficult. Severity of practice. And what I mean by this is that there are folks who don't think that that referencing is such a serious or important concept. And so for that reason, when mistakes are made, if those things get published, there's a break in the chain. So now someone is unable to access said document. And as a result, the folks who are writing based on this previous literature are only taking a limited view or a limited interpretation of the source data. Again, really understanding the practice of referencing, like the why of what we do it, the why we do it. Time is a huge issue, especially for folks who are not as well versed in the referencing apps. Full disclosure, it took me a really long time to figure out Zotero. And so a lot of time could be spent checking, double checking citations to make sure that I knew what I was doing. And then in there, you're sometimes losing your train of thought, you're growing frustrated. And so I think that can be a real challenge to our students. Like the severity of practice, it's this perceived applicability. So some folks who are in certain majors simply don't feel that sense of utility for citation in the same way. And so there comes a challenge when you've moved from, say, a writing intensive class to another class where you may have to write something, but you haven't, that skill hasn't been as reinforced, right? There's definitely a challenge there, and your approach to that can be misinterpreted. The level in which you are organized on the front end. So again, if we are creating a map, we have to be able to have directions to get us from A to B. And so if we don't have that list of citations, or we're writing on big ideas and doing free writing without double checking, without inputting those things, without having the page numbers for our direct quotes and things like that, this becomes a lot more difficult. And then, the research indicates that there's a cost benefit analysis for students. If they feel that their faculty don't care or are not going to ding them too much, they might be willing to take the 2 points and not commit to the reference. They may be willing to go through and lose the last formatting points because they see formatting as a chore that's really inconsequential to their goal, which is to turn a paper in and get a grade that they feel is sufficient. So being really intentional about the value of referencing is really important. In addition, societally, we have just created some gray areas around what original work is and our generous usage of the copy paste button. And I use copy paste because a lot of us were familiar with Word, we're familiar with Google Docs, but also when we think about social media, when we think about retweets and reposts and things like that, in the span of a second, we can repurpose someone else's ideas, whether they are scholarly or not. And because that has become such a part of our culture, sometimes it is difficult if you're not committed to identifying the original source. It becomes difficult to be able to actually trace where the original source came from. And so now we're having this experience of dilution, right? Because you've used someone else's idea. Maybe this idea has become more popular. And so we recycle it, and then someone else recycles it, and then someone else recycles it. And now the original content is lost, and we don't have a map back to what that person actually meant. This can have significant consequences if we're not really mindful of where we're getting things from. So just as a review, I'm going to talk about the differences between citation and referencing. So I'm going to refer to the citation as bank statement. So if we purchase things on Amazon, if you're looking at your online banking, you might notice several charges from Amazon. Now, I know that I got something from Amazon, but I don't know specifically what it was. I know when I got it, and I know the date, right? And so this is that we're mentioning the source in the text. We are putting the reader on notice that this is where the information came from. So it's a quick way for someone to acknowledge, oh, okay, that's where this came from. It's kind of like a mental note for you to go to the reference list and get additional details, right? And citations are going to be throughout the text of the document. Now and I'll just refer to APA because that's the convention that I use most often. Now with APA 7, if you have 3 or more authors, their names are not in the text. So that goes a bit even further when we're talking about how we map out, because you have that first author there and you have this date. That's why it's so important when we are notating if there are folks with the same names to have things like A, B, and C if necessary, so that we can make sure that we are aligning what's in the text to what's in the reference list. Now, if we compare, referencing is going to be that itemized receipt. So you don't see on your bank statement everything you bought from Amazon, but on your track orders receipt or that invoice, it's going to tell you that you made the decision today to buy more than you thought that you were going to. This happens to me very often when I am window shopping. So referencing is about that broader system. It's going to tell you specifically what was used. And so those key dates, and I mentioned them again at length later here, but we're talking about, okay, who wrote it? Where was it published? When was it published? What was their title? These are giving additional clues. DOIs, whenever possible, are fantastic in that now we have this digital indicator where someone can immediately click and all of a sudden they have access. This is very exciting because that hasn't always been the case with certain journals where you could go and instantly click and be able to retrieve these websites. And especially prior to DOIs, sometimes you were working with dead links. And so you weren't actually able to gain access to these prior articles. So again, we're doing a really good job of mapping. So if you're looking at your individual budget or your family budget and you're using this example, your bank statement's going to tell you how much money you spent. Your itemized receipt is going to tell you where, when, and how you spent that money. And this is the connection that we're making and the difference between that in-text citation and then your references. The goal is so that you can follow up. The goal is action. The goal is action, whether that is vetting a source, whether that is fully understanding the context in which you are reading. It is being able to read those resources for yourself and create something new. It gives you the opportunity to double check things. And we see those called references, bibliography, or works cited, but our writing conventions believe in this so significantly that they warrant a separate heading and a separate section of the paper. And I think that is really important. So here are some of those big considerations. I'm thinking about who we're looking for in the reference sections, right? Who wrote this original work? Who did they write for, right? What was their positionality? What is your positionality? And what voice are they bringing to the table? Because sometimes, at least I find in my classes, and I'll even go back to my own dissertation work, I would look at something and you have this quote somewhere and it looks really good. And you're thinking that's the icing on the cake of what I am trying to say. But is it really? I need to now do some digging above, below, throughout the article to really understand if I just thought what they said sounded good, or if what they said directly relates to what I'm trying to convey. And then thinking about what this is. When we're thinking about the types of writing, the types of content that we're integrating into academic writing, how are we teaching, and in our own practice, how are we considering the types of sources that we are bringing together? Are we committed to making sure that we have a reference list that provides us with a diversified sample of multiple ideas that are in service to our project? Where are we missing representation? What choices have we made if we have a predominant author? Are we saying that we're committed to their canon? And are we saying that without digging deeply? Because our reference list is the representation of what we've agreed to, right? What is also our citational practice or style? So how we've aligned ourselves to the tenets of APA, the tenets of MLA, things like that. Where is the context? Are we writing for academics? Are we writing for the workplace? Are we writing for industry? And how then do our citations and references reflect that? What's our obligation to presenting counter arguments and things of that nature? And a lot of times we are writing to get this close approximation of whatever was asked for in a prompt, whether it's a book proposal, whether it's an assignment. We're saying, okay, we need to find this many articles that sounds reasonable, right? We need to create these conclusions, but really it's this thoughtfulness that sometimes we don't always have a lot of time to talk through or to even reflect on ourselves. When was the article written? And what were the circumstances that folks were under as it was written? One of the things I think about often recently is so many articles on generative AI, so many articles. Everyone's an expert on ChatGPT, the same way everyone was an expert on online learning with COVID-19, right? And so you get all of these things and you have to put it in context, okay? Because if you just started teaching online this very semester of COVID and you use this as an opportunity to write an article, that's a decision. But that's a decision that now if I choose to reference you, has consequences for me if I'm taking this verbatim without looking deeper at the literature over the past several decades that's really talked about online learning. Also, what are we doing with the acknowledgement of the counter arguments, and how are we incorporating context and nuance? And then finally, the why. Like, what is our point in writing whatever it is that we are writing? And if we understand our point, then we can understand how we need to look within our own sources to make sure that that point is actually supported. I think a lot of times we really need to focus on that why and making sure that our whys are aligned, and if not, acknowledging the differences. So I'm going into the chat, and Irene, I see the comment that's really I appreciate the mention that there's been some confusion around the terms reference, bibliography, and bibliography. I tend to follow whatever the convention of the style guide is that I have to use. So that's almost always APA, but there have been a couple of times, actually more recently, where I've had to use Chicago and Harvard, and I'm like, oh wait, you have to, like, I've had to shift my brain a little bit. I like the term works cited as well, but I don't find myself able to use it that often. I think that one of the things I like the most about works cited, which is why I want to take the time to respond, is that it's very clear what the point is, right? Sometimes, depending on your students, the experiences that they've had with writing and content, they don't use the term bibliography. They're not using the term reference necessarily. They just think, oh, okay, I have to make sure I have citations in there. But works cited is kind of, to me, it's very clear what you're doing. You are taking responsibility for the things that you've placed in your paper, and now you're listing them in detail below. So I do feel like it's a really easily understood phrase. So thank you very much for that. Common struggles that we see with referencing are how we are acknowledging the direct quotes, the paraphrasing, summarizing the visuals. So when I did this who, where, what, when, why, like thinking about how we are using these things are really important to considering the role that they play in our reference section, but also the weight that they play in the context of the paper, which we generally think about in terms of citations, right? How many times is it featured? But if there is a predominant citation in the paper, then whatever is referenced there, the quality of that reference becomes heightened. It becomes especially significant. So I've got some little figures here, the top being this image of charts and graphs and imagery, which sometimes is hard for folks to wrap their mind around because they see, oh, I could get this off of Creative Commons, or I can get it off of Google Images, so I'll just cut and paste that, and now it belongs to me, right? And it doesn't. In the top right corner, I have two cows, and one is saying moo, and the other says, I just said that, use your own words. And so in thinking about the things that are, commonly shared and appropriate for everyone to use versus the idea of plagiarism. And then of course on the end, on the bottom too, I have the summary block, because it's difficult. It is difficult to summarize when you were inspired by another idea, because now you're taking responsibility for that inspiration and summarizing it in a way that's, one, in service to your argument, but two, representative of the concepts that were shared. And then of course, direct quotes, which sometimes we can get comfortable with by placing direct quotes. Sometimes it can be challenging if there's an organization issue or there was a quote that felt really profound at the time and we didn't get the proper information. And we have to make sure that we are, one, remembering that, and two, circling back to figure out where it came from. But also sometimes we use direct quotes as a bit of an added support. And we have to ask ourselves, is this the best use of the framing of the literature? So challenges that I see in that are we managing our sources? What's common knowledge versus things that need to be cited, which is becoming more and more of a challenge as we have more and more open source access to information. Folks start to feel very strongly that they've already come to the table knowing these things, even though they just searched it a couple of minutes ago. Then, of course, issues with procrastination, but the biggest one tends to be with confidence. We don't feel we have the words, so we want to use someone else's. And so as it relates to references, again, now not only are what we're saying is that we believe in these findings in service to our writing, but now more specifically, we believe that what this person said is so important that their words have to be reflected. So that says a little something else about the value that we're placing on the reference. So if I see several quotes, I'm wondering, how does this show up as like an element of conceptual framing or theoretical framing in this paper? So being strategic is going to be really important there. So what can we do? We can think about how we organize and how we advance plan. We need to be strategic. And I have a chess set in the background for your imagery there. What is the usefulness of this quote? Because again, the reference list is the thing that we are answering for. And so we're thinking about the role of that person's voice, of that author or those authors in our papers, and we have a responsibility to manage that. Similarly with paraphrasing, do we have the confidence to do so, and are we doing that well? How large, what's the size of this summary? How much of it takes up space in our papers, and what is the purpose and role of it as it relates to our own work? So getting into that purpose, and again, now we've got Google Maps because our references show us the direction that we need to go to navigate whatever concept that we'd like to show. The general convention, as we all know, includes your author, publication, your title of the work, the source, publisher, page numbers, and DOIs where available. So it's all in the details, right? Making sure that those formats align with what is in the reference section. Thank you. Because if we don't, now we have a broken link. And we've all had it happen, I'm sure, when you're getting copy edits back and you've missed a letter in the citation, or you put 2020 instead of 2021, and we've broken the link, right? And the easiest way to think about the importance of this is really kind of using that GPS analogy. Because if we can't turn left because no one's telling us to turn left, then we're usually going to go straight. Like, most readers of your work are not intuitively just gonna figure it out. What they'll do is, if they don't see the reference linked right there, they're just not going to visit. And now they have less of a link to your content. Again, the importance of crafting that reference list in really intentional ways, as we've described, and then I'm going to talk about some of the common pitfalls. So these are referencing styles, and this will be available for everyone, so I'm not going to kind of belabor the point here, but there are differences in the types of citation styles. I included the in-text just because it's important to have that acknowledgement. You can see the different names of how the reference lists are showing up. And then I have a book citation example there. But it's important, as you're crafting the reference list, that you are choosing wisely. Should you choose to paraphrase? Should you choose the direct quote? Again, these things speak to your reference list, and I just offer a few considerations for your review. If this is about ease of understanding, for example, with the paraphrasing, what you're saying, if we're paraphrasing a decent sized chunk of text, is we're saying that this is something that is important. And when you look at my reference list and you click on it, you'll be able to see its importance, perhaps in your own work, because it has guided us. Same thing with direct quotes. We're saying we can't say this in a context that would be sufficient. And so really, we're suggesting that you go back to the source material so that you can fully understand it in the context that was provided by the author. So there's a lot to remember with referencing tools. So we're going to go over some of the finer points of formatting as quickly as possible. So I just pulled some items comparing Zotero, Mendeley, and EndNote. Some of this depends on what your institution supports, and some of this depends on where you feel technically proficient. But there are a lot of things to think about when you're considering using a reference tool, or considering changing a reference tool. One of the challenges, and I'll speak for myself, but one of the challenges that I have is that if I think about using a new tool, how much of my time and space is in thinking about how to use that tool? If I don't have time to figure out use of the tool, then it doesn't have the same type of utility for me. And then I'm spending more time on that than time strategizing how I'm making sense of the references. So anything that we can do, in support with our library staff, in support with our writing staff, and then just in terms of starting coursework with this, is how do we get folks to become comfortable with something and have a level of confidence so that they can use it all the time. So we have that muscle memory. And when you're finding interesting things, you're just plopping it in Zotero, as opposed to, it's almost like patch writing, if you know what I mean, like where you start to write and then quick, you got to find a citation and then you're adding it to the system. That doesn't really help us. You want it to be something that's always kind of running in the background. So more references for text context, and you can see the differences is, name, date, title, journal, when did it happen, where is it found? These are all of the points that we're constantly wanting to make. But we have these challenges because now we have all sorts of online sources. And it was one thing, right? When we started, you saw blogs and websites, and all of the cautionary tales were, be careful because those are not peer-reviewed sources. It could come from anywhere. And then we became comfortable with online sources. Why? Because most of the sources that we were able to easily access were online. So now that argument kind of went out the window. And our style guides and within our own disciplines, we had to get good at figuring out how to cite things that were online. In addition to that, we have white papers and industry content that we can really benefit from referencing things that don't necessarily follow that standard book format. We've recently seen this huge piece where now we're having these conversations on social media in real time, right? And so folks are adding to the conversation, and the art and challenge of influence leave folks needing to make a decision. What am I referencing? How do I reference it? Is it valuable, right? And how am I getting that information? So it becomes a real challenge. Thinking about how we're citing those things and remembering those key pieces: who wrote it, when did they write it, what did they title it, where did it come from, how can I find it, is really going to help us no matter what the format is. Because if we can't do those things, there is no map, right? And we're seeing how we have to think expansively, I think, just in education, as to what we're going to do to get some of that back, because we're seeing that disappear. So I have a comment in the chat. My biggest challenge when teaching students to use EndNote are the functions that appear or are not on their screens. I find myself acting as an IT technician fixing digital yes yes, digital glitches instead of a professor teaching about referencing. And that's one of the huge challenges, right? Is that it takes away from the importance of referencing, because if someone doesn't have the right plugin or software update, or they're using a different version of the system, now you're spending so much time on those individual conversations that we're losing the fact that we're really trying to make this easier for folks. Irene mentioned that journalistic sources are the most recent and explicit and illustrate the point. And I think that that's really what we're seeing, is that for all of our dedication to the traditional scholarly publishing pipeline, right? There are now sources, rich sources of information, often that reference the things that we're mentioning, that can clearly and concisely provide information, especially when you're looking at, so Irene mentioned the research on corruption. When you're looking at things that are timely, rapidly changing, the process to publish and get that content out there, there's a shorter time. And so you're able to keep the most up-to-date and accurate information when you are expanding the types of references that you're considering. And then I found our library website is a very welcome help with editing resources. And yes, wherever we can find those partners, our librarians, the software, wherever we can find those supports, we should be using them, because again, we don't want to detract from those real reasons for referencing because of the minutia. And it freezes students. It stops them from feeling like they can move on, because, and some don't, some care to varying degrees. I don't want to suggest that this is the only thing that provides a challenge with regard to appropriate referencing. But if you're lacking confidence already, and you feel that formatting references is such a roadblock, that's all you'll focus on, at the expense of all of the other learning and synthesis and summary that is going on. So anything that we can do to have those resources in one place for our students to explore, but also kind of teaching them the time management around using those things, because I want you to learn it, but I don't want you to tell me that you can't submit something because you spent so much time learning the referencing software that you weren't actually able to get to the paper. So kind of putting that in context, I think, is really helpful as well. Thank you so much for your engagement there. All right, so some social media things. We're using Twitter because I'm on Twitter. So, or I was on Twitter, whatever. I'm not recognizing X. So I've got Twitter in in here. However, we'll see these things change, but there are a couple of questions that I think we should all be asking ourselves. So again, as you can see, this was easy to use because we can describe what a post is, right? We have the concept for that. We have the address so that you can click and you can access the address, and we have who created it. We have the date. So, we used to put retrieved by, but here's the issue. A lot of these pieces have multimedia components, and we have to really understand the authorship. So if I am sending a tweet or a social media post and I am reposting imagery that doesn't belong to me or that I don't have the rights to, if I am reposting music and I don't have those rights, where is your responsibility? And these are conversations that I want to encourage all of us to continue to explore in research, because we haven't gotten very good at it. So our publishers say, do you have permission? And that is the standard. And that's a very good standard, right? But they're not really thinking about the reposts and the dilution of ownership. They're saying, make sure that you have permission. Disney's not giving me permission, so I'm probably not going to be able to have a Hamilton quote in my next article, right? However, if I'm using things that don't really feel like they have that direct link, I need to think about what those expectations are. With music, it seems like it's been fairly easy. We have the author, we have whoever published it, and when those permissions were granted. But there's a lot of consequences. When we are not having those key dates, if we don't have the information that we need, then no one can track it. Sometimes that can be misinterpreted as intended or unintended misattribution, right? But we're also doing something that's bigger than that. We are now contributing to published literature or to searchable content that is confusing to the algorithm because it's not accurate. It's not as accurate, right? So again, we're altering that GPS a bit. We are influencing the production of knowledge and the sharing of knowledge because maybe we had a fantastic quote and it was not used in context and there's no map. And sometimes we're causing unintended harm. And I think we need to be really, really mindful of our responsibility in knowing where these things come from. Because I think we've all seen it in different instances, just the act of endorsing someone else's content. And that's what we're doing. References are endorsing someone else's content. If we're endorsing someone else's content without knowing where it came from and why it's there, we're accepting responsibility without knowing what we're accepting responsibility for. And so it's, yes, there's formatting, but there's also what we say that we believe in. And these are the receipts that show us what we believe in. You know, we have a lot of tools that can help us to reference very well and to connect references. And I use these images for the obvious reason. Now, if you're clicking on the cited by feature of Google Scholar, you're instantly seeing the other people who found a certain article valuable. Does that mean that all of their articles are valuable to us? Absolutely not. But we have to be able to help our students and help ourselves not fall into that trap of, well, they found this useful, so that supports my argument, because we don't know if it does. We don't know what their reference list looks like. We simply pressed a button and we allowed the algorithm to decide for us. And so as we're catching up to what the possibilities are, particularly with generative AI and how we think about the value of a given citation, we need to be really, really careful with that. So I don't have a link on this for the purposes of this talk, but I'd like you all to consider, there's an example, a site called Connected Papers. I'm not sure if you are familiar with it. But basically, the site allows you to put in the name of an article or a topic, and research rabbit as well. Thank you, Martine. That I remember seeing that one as well. You can put these titles in, and what it does is it develops a network analysis. So you have little bubbles of varying sizes that say, oh, this is in this relationship to this article. What that tells us is that it has cited the same thing a certain number of times, that has had this assigned amount of value. If we are not careful, we mistake that for synthesis. We mistake that for summary, because the reality of the publishing process is that there are a lot more nuance and relationship that go into the decisions that people make to cite and recite. And we're all aware of that. But sometimes we see these tools and you see the bubble and we're automatically making assumptions. So as much as these things give us direct relationships that can help support the arguments that we're creating, we have to be mindful that in that reference list, we are the authors of what summarizes the content that we're putting out into the world. And so if we are not careful and we have this over reliance on these tools that are number counting, we'll dilute our message and we'll continue to send a message that's less than correct and often inaccurate, that suggests that we have vetted things that we haven't. And we want to be really, really careful about that. I've got APA 7 up here just because we are still scrambling to try and figure out appropriate references and in-text citations. Here are a couple of those issues. In terms of style guides, APA is considering ChatGPT and related things as a personal communication, but you're not talking to anyone, right? You are looking at an algorithm. And this gives us a couple of problems. It kind of muffles the nature of what collaboration is, because this is algorithmic collaboration, except you didn't do a content analysis and you're not familiar with the origin of where these concepts came from. And we know that they are not common knowledge. So now we've got a responsibility to backward map and understand quality, because the role of transparency, the responsibility of transparency is still on us. Even if an algorithm has proven or shown an example that what we have to say is relevant. And so we really have to be careful. And I will go out on a limb. I don't have better ideas right now, but I will say that just suggesting that a search term, we used ChatGPT for a search term at a certain time, like that is woefully inadequate. Because the things that are generated from the prompt, one, are not able to be replicated. There's no map, and we don't know kind of the learning of the algorithm to be able to come to these conclusions. And so while we're thinking about how we use these tools and partners in our writing, we also have to think about the fact that that responsibility is still on us, and that type of referencing is inadequate. Also, how are our students able to learn if we're not able to kind of backtrack what the finer points of summary or organization are that they intended to find in a ChatGPT session? So the thank you for the generative AI editing suggestion. Yes. So here's another piece of this, is that we had become increasingly comfortable with the generative AI as is. Like if you're using Gmail now, they've got the little prompts. If you're using Microsoft Word, they have these prompts in there, not to that larger extent, but Grammarly is now another one that has really influenced the way that information comes to us. And because it's instantaneous, sometimes it doesn't always feel like we are responsible for the creation. Martine or Natalie, can you let me know how much time I have? My timer, I can't see my timer. Okay, so just very quickly, thinking about the thank you, the virality, the idea of virality and common knowledge is another thing that I think we should be thinking about when we're talking about referencing. So we have access to all of these things, and they're constantly diluted. And the idea of what is peer review, what is not peer reviewed, and just the result of influencing is a huge thing. And because we're not really good at formatting those citations, we're really bad at creating references that indicate where this information is coming from. And what this is doing is it's giving everyone just enough information to potentially make harmful decisions and really may contribute to us losing our way. And that's going to continue to have an impact as we think about the ways that I have this social media landscape imagery, but it kind of talks about the different groups and different ways that content is being created. Many of these are used in academic contexts, even the gaming, and how we cite those and attribute knowledge is going to be really, really important coming forward. And I think students will appreciate having those conversations, because we don't want to give inappropriate attributions, and we don't want to suggest that something is common knowledge, especially if it has social or cultural significance to a certain group. We want to make sure that we have as much integrity in that process as possible. And then lastly, like as I shared my story with you all, and I think everyone again has these stories. Algorithms are designed to dilute those stories. to come up with something that is more easily palatable for as many people as possible. It's how market research is done. It is how we use these things in business to get the thing that feels the best or looks like an approximation of what we think is acceptable. But our stories are more complex and your reference lists are more complex. And we want our reference list to be able to tell a story that details the decisions that we made and is representative of the things that we value. So in closing, I just hope that you'll remember the significance of references, that you'll continue to challenge those inconsistencies that threaten the purpose of referencing or even misrepresent it. And finally, that we're mapping out and being really strategic, partnering with the folks that we need to, providing that feedback for our students, so that we're making sure that we're promoting academic integrity and we're improving the clarity of our writing, because we're able to walk our readers through the decisions that we have made. And that is all I have for you. Happy to take any questions or comments, but this is my contact information. If you have access to a phone, you can take a picture of the QR code there.
Thank you very much, Ceceilia. Does anybody have any questions for our keynote today? I have one. I'm very curious. Would you explain, because I wrote it down because I thought, oh my God, that's really a good way of thinking about it. But would you explain what you meant by you have to backward, I really wrote it down, backward map if you use text generated by AI. What would you tell a student about backward mapping? How would they go about it? Why do they need to do it?
So I think for a couple of reasons. So the easiest way is I tell them the same thing with ChatGPT. Sorry, not ChatGPT, Google Scholar, is that in order to start looking at articles in any search engine, you've got to be really careful about the language that you use, the operators, where we're putting quotes and things like that. And while with generative AI, you're never really able to replicate one-to-one, the only way that I can help is if I'm able to map out the decisions that you made to get you there. So a couple of things. What do we input into those systems, and who does that information belong to, right? It's not a good idea to put a faculty assignment or a bibliography. Thank you so much, Irene, for joining. I appreciate it, and thank you all for your comments in the chat. I can't help if I don't know the decisions that you made to get there. And first of all, knowing that it's not okay to just take someone else's information and stick it into these systems. But secondly, what have you asked the system to do? What was the purpose of asking? So there's a piece that's coming out for Sage in the next couple of months, and it gets into the nitty-gritty of prompt engineering. One, of knowing what our responsibility is in teaching prompts, supervising what that looks like, and looking at output and having expectations around the parameters of output. So what I would say is that I should reasonably be able to approximate something representative of what you asked for in that prompt. And you can easily tell when someone doesn't, because the systems are such that it's always one-to-one. There's a request, there's a solution. There's a request, there's a solution. If you ask for 4 bullet points, you'll get 4 bullet points.
Go ahead.
I have a quick question. You mentioned generative AI, we can regard it as personal communication. I'll give you one instance, and I think that's really fits in the personal communication. I was revising an abstract of something, a collaborative work. And suddenly I was using Grammarly to see if there are any errors. It's really helpful, especially with referencing. There are things that you know how to do it, but there are small places where you can't catch, human eyes won't be able to catch. But I
Mhm.
really like it. But suddenly to suggest that there is a different, how would you like the two versions of the abstract? I wasn't happy with our abstract, but suddenly it suggested an abstract. Oh, I looked at it, it's really good. It's based
Mm.
on my version, but made it so, basically I really like it. But I don't know how to cite it. Should I say Grammarly help me edit this, or should I just take it for granted as, a friendly personal communication from a friend help me to edit it or revise it?
So it's interesting. If I have, there are times where, let's say I'm writing a paper, if I have peer reviewers who made like substantive additions and they are not authors, I'm able to acknowledge them. And so I have seen cases where folks acknowledge that edits and refinements were made using these things, like in the acknowledgement section, right? Because I don't know that there's a citation there, depending on it depends on what you asked. I would
see.
say.
Yeah,
And you
it's
didn't
still
ask
evolving.
something that was content related, right?
I didn't
But if
even
I had my
ask.
grad student source my lit review and they're not an author, like they need to be acknowledged
Of course,
for the building of that. So I think that's where I sit with it. Grammarly is a tricky one, right? Because we first started using Grammarly and it was all about copy edits. And then first they added, should this sound more descriptive, engaging, convincing? And so I don't know if you know, but when OpenAI first started, I was on the beta for Jasper and a couple of those tools, and it was specifically for blog recycling. So people would all of a sudden turn like a funny post into something more serious because they had a sponsor that wanted them to speak to the severity of something. And so it was all for changing that story. So the same technology is now being used for Grammarly. And even though they say right now that they're not really helping you do those things, but they're collecting the data so that they can. So every time you click, this is for an academic audience that I'm trying to convince. They want to get to the point where they're able to give you that option. I don't think that they're there yet. So in terms of content, I don't think it's a reference section thing, but I do think that anytime, it's like if in analysis, there are folks who are now using generative AI in their analysis and they'll acknowledge like that.
Could be maybe an acknowledging thing. In the past, we just use it as the spelling check in the word the same way.
Well, that's the thing. If it's a full rewrite, like if it's, and I've used Grammarly, sometimes I think it caused me more stress than I actually
exactly
started with when I've used it. But I don't feel like spell checking and things like that fall into that area. It's just with the style, if the style changes substantively.
Positive. I found I turn them off. You can turn them off. You can turn whatever off if you don't want them. But anyway, thank you very much.
But that's a really good question. Thank you.
Thank you.
Ceceilia, I really liked, I'm the one who put in the chat that I really liked your analogies about the bank statement and the itemized receipts. When I teach referencing, I usually use the analogy of a coffee shop with my students. So I say it's like they're sitting at a table with other authors that are drinking coffee and discussing a topic and exchanging ideas, and you're kind of witnessing it, but eventually you're joining the conversation. So on their assignments, they're relating what they have witnessed with the authors exchanging ideas and then their own interpretation as well. And it seems to be a visual that the students can relate to, but I think I'm going to use yours as well when I get a chance.
You know, I like both of those, and the coffee shop really it resonates with me because that's exactly what's like, you can make a short reference to a paper, right? But it's that synthesis and the conversations that happen when folks are sitting back and forth and asking questions and gaining clarity. That is really what the reference section is about. So I like that a lot. We'll have some mutual swapping here.
There you go. Thank you very much for your presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, everybody. We have, unless we have any other questions, we're losing participants as we go. But I'd really like to, I thought your presentation was excellent. It gave us another way of looking at referencing. I like the idea of, like I said earlier, the backward map, but also the idea of looking at mapping of London and all that to follow through the referencing. And I really like the credit card way. You know what? It was easy to follow, and I think students can relate to that type of information. So thank you for a very interesting thought.
Thank you all for your time. Really appreciate it, and happy to continue this conversation. I know many of us already are, but I'm really excited to continue to talk about this and to make sure that our meanings of referencing are also represented in the conversations that are coming out around different referencing conventions and changes in citation as well.
Thank you. Just joining everyone else's voice. This was really interesting. I really enjoyed it. Thanks very much.
Of course. Well, have a wonderful, I think for some of us, it's still morning. And some of us, it might be a bit later. Great.